Let's go on and talk about economics here. We're going to talk about a number of things as far as market situations, a few issues on policy that Chris Wall may expand on later, but some that have some immediate effects on us. What are the key factors for the next year to 2 years in our business? Well, we still haven't gotten away from ethanol and biofuels policy, and of course, Washington is involved in a big debate over that again at the moment. Grains and cost of production and what's happened to the grain prices this fall, even during harvest. The policy decisions that are being made in Washington. The Gypsy rule is a major one. We also had just recently a rule an addition of mandatory price reporting for pork, and we're going to get into the process of making that rule. Of course, the issue of antibiotics, and I'm not going to talk much about that. I think Chris is going to talk about it. The whole macroeconomic situation is still very important to the industry, its impact on demand, and it certainly looks like that has been improving, but a lot of mixed signals. And then, of course, last month's elections, I think, has some impact for the next several years, especially in the impact that it had in the committee chairmanships with Representative Frank Lucas of Oklahoma taking over in the House and Senator Deb Stabenow from Michigan taking over in the Senate. Frank, I think we know he's a pretty well-known quantity here. What he's going to look for in the case of Ms. Stabenow, I don't know that we know much about her at this point. So some impacts there that we're going to have to deal with. Let's talk about ethanol for a moment. It's still quite important. About 210 plants in the United States with a capacity of 14.2 billion gallons, roughly. One point I make is that of all of that ethanol, 16.9 million, roughly 1% of the total, is cellulosic ethanol. And that was supposed to be the next wave. We should have been, according to the Congress, that group of scientists that make our policy, we should have been well above that by now. And of course, there's going to be a fight. Some people in the ethanol lobby have said, well, why don't you just redefine advanced biofuels and let corn take part of that renewable fuel standard, which is kind of a de facto end run on the renewable fuel standard and would shove even more corn into ethanol than what the current starch-based renewable fuel standard does. 350 million gallons still under construction, a small amount. If this thing ran at full capacity, it could use just over 5 billion bushels of corn. Now, those plants are back in the black now. They've spent, the better part of a year kind of running at break even, and this is a business that I think is going to just keep coming back to the blue line here, which is the fixed cost line. There's excess capacity. Anytime that there's a profit, they will increase ethanol production, and ethanol production has been record high in recent weeks. That will drive down ethanol prices and probably drive up corn prices a bit and bid those profits away. So we're going to continue to bounce along here so that their margin over corn and other cash costs, which is the blue area of this chart, keeps coming back to those fixed cost lines. The efficient plants will still be making money. The less efficient plants will actually be losing money. That's kind of the way of a zero economic profit business. When I talk about the renewable fuel standard, it's 12 billion gallons this year, 12.6 next year. Notice that the rate of increase, though, is lower now. Is about 600 million per year. It was going up at about 900 million per year. So it only pulls another 200 million or so bushels of corn out each year, in addition to the previous year, as this renewable fuel standard goes up at this slower pace. Where do we stand on usage? Well, the forecast for the coming crop year is 4.8 billion bushels of corn used for ethanol. You notice that feed and residual number went up in the USDA numbers. I think the only reason that number is higher is that we used some of that feed back before the crop year ever began. They've got to account for that, but it actually got used in late August and September because of the poor quality of last year's crop. Some growth, a little bit of slow growth in non-ethanol food, seed, and industrial usage. That's corn sweeteners. That corn export number for next year is flat at the moment. We hear a lot of rumblings out of China that they may be very active in the corn market, and we'll see if that's as we go through time. But I'm still pretty bullish for grain prices from where we are right now because of these high usages. Even though we had the third largest crop ever, excuse me, usage just keeps going up. Here is a chart that I've started using pretty consistently, and that is the blue line is production. We can see growth in production. That represents last year's corn crop. Doesn't have the coming year on it. Production above ethanol is the pink line, so the difference in those two is ethanol. And you can see that corn availability has actually gone down over the last few years because of the growth of ethanol. But if we throw DDGs back in, it has a slight uptrend in that total feed and residual plus DDGs. Now, one point I would make on that is that there's some offset there because we're growing less barley, less milo, and we're certainly feeding less wheat than we were. So the amount of feed ingredients available to the livestock and poultry industries has been about flat since the early 2000s. It just hasn't grown much. It's going to stay that way as we continue to ramp up the renewable fuel standard, and that situation will get worse if they start redefining the renewable fuel standard. The important things this winter, and like I said, Chris, I think we'll talk about these. Of course, the 15% blend allowance has been approved for cars 2007 and later. They have delayed anything on 2001 to 2006 until January. A lot of problems with logistics here and liability. How are you going to make sure that people don't put it in the wrong car, and what's your local liability if there is? Do you have to have it in the wrong car, and what's your local liability if there is? Do you have to have an extra pump? How is this going to work? No, this is an allowance. It's not a requirement, so it allows them to go to 15%. Most major blenders have announced that they're not going to do it. So while it's there, I don't know that it's really going to have much impact on the market. The renewable of the blender's tax credit and the import tariff, much more important there. And both of those are somewhat questionable, especially with the election results, but this Congress could act on that before the new Congress takes over in January. A proposal to lower the blender's tax credit and spend the rest of that money on infrastructure is out there. I think you have to keep the two of them pretty close, or you really invite some action on the part of Brazil under the WTO. And then last week we had this thing of Al Gore speaking to a conference in Greece. And you remember Al Gore. He's the guy who invented the Internet and discovered global warming. And he made some statements. It is not good policy to have these massive subsidies for first-generation ethanol, that is starch-based ethanol. The energy conversion ratios are at best very small. I had a certain fondness for farmers in Iowa because I was about to run for president, and the percentage of corn being used for ethanol definitely has an impact on food prices. And so, in short, Al said, I did it for the votes, and I think that's probably something pretty common among politicians on this subject, but it certainly undermines the argument to extend the blender's tax credit at this critical juncture, and it's going to be an interesting part of the mix. The November WASDE that came out back, I think on the 11th of November, forecast the lowest stocks-to-use ratio since 1996 for corn. You can see it at the bottom of the USDA November column, the third from the right, 6.2%. USDA increased their estimated season average farm level price for corn to $4.80 to $5.60. That was mainly because of a slight reduction in yield from a month ago, bushel and a half per acre. The crop down to 12.54 billion. Again, that's still the third largest crop we've ever had, and it's going to be the highest price of corn that we've ever had. You can see right here the stocks use being very low, only one lower observation in my data set, and of course that range of prices up there right around $5, and clearly the highest corn price we've had. If you look at this in historical terms for corn prices, I've said that we've moved to a new normal range of somewhere in the 3 to 4.25 or 4.5 range on corn. Well, we're well above that, and those prices, according to the futures markets, are predicted to kind of stay that way. In addition, we've seen this run-up happen during harvest, and this is the third time in 5 years we've seen that happen during harvest time. So an important thing there as far as the relationship of these prices. The next one, soybean meal, not out of the top of the range of the new range that we deal with, but right at the top of that, falling somewhat next year as we go through 2011 and the new crop crop from South America and potentially the new U.S. crop comes in, but still in the upper range. Now, one thing is important here is we didn't get in the kind of tight supply situations we did the last 2 years. The summer of '08, of course, was driven by oil prices. Last year was, especially that second spike there, was some very tight supplies as we got to the end of the year supplies on soybeans. We could be setting ourselves up for those kind of run-ups either next fall, probably the next fall, right now, because we're going to get a lot more acres of corn, I think, out of this situation coming into next spring. What does that mean for feed costs? Well, this is my feed cost index, and it has gone up substantially. You can see the brown line was a year ago, where we've been recently, as late as late September, at just under $200. That's traded up. It's backed off a little bit, but generally, feed costs $50 to $70 a ton higher. When we look at break-even cost of production, what does that mean? Well, as of yesterday, the projected break-evens based on futures prices for Iowa's farrow-to-finish operations was about $75 break-even on a carcass weight basis next year, up from $68.50 for this year. So substantially higher cost of production that we have to deal with. And I alluded a moment ago, the big problem may be next year. We're going to have a huge battle for acres this spring. Corn, wheat, soybeans are all going to fight for acres, even cotton. I mean, we've had cotton at $120, $30, $40 a hundredweight this year. Tremendous prices for cotton. And so all of those are going to fight for acres as we go into the spring. I just don't think we're going to have any margin for error in this next growing season. Any kind of problems would force some rationing of an already short 2011 carryout. The renewable fuel standard is going to force 200 more million bushels away from livestock and into ethanol again next year. So any problem next summer could cause an availability problem come the summer of 2012. And so we'd add some potential animal welfare problems to high costs. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to run out of corn, because we won't. The market will ration that. But the market doesn't necessarily ration the supply in every geography. Nationally, we'll have corn left in the bin at the end of the crop year, but that doesn't mean that in some places it might be difficult to find feed ingredients late in the summer of 2012. The other piece of real uncertainty is hanging over this market is this proposed Gypsy rule, and I want to just spend just a little time. I'm not going to go into any depth on it, but this rule, the comment period ended a week ago Monday. There were thousands and thousands. The last I heard was 26,000 and change somewhere in there, and Chris might be able to update us on that as well. But this had its genesis back in '08. The Farm Bill said Congress told Gypsy that they should write rules on 5 topics, and these are the 5. The criteria that would be considered to establishing whether an undue or unreasonable preference or advantage had been given, a reasonable notice of suspension of delivery of birds, obviously specific to the poultry industry and really specific to the chicken industry. When a required additional capital investment is a violation of the Act, again, aimed at a problem in the chicken and in poultry industry, but it includes us. When a reasonable time period has been given to remedy a breach of contract, again, addressing problems that have been seen in the chicken contract production sector. And finally, what makes for a fair arbitration process. That had been we've been dealing with that since the Farm Bill. We've had to have statements in production contracts that give contract growers the option of opting out of mandatory arbitration. And by the way, if you don't have that in your production contracts, you need to get it in there now, because Gypsy has fined some people for not having that in there. But this one also defines, what are the things that have to be done to make that process fair. And Phil Kunkel says it really is an expensive arbitration process, but still it's probably not not the worst part of this rule by any stretch of the imagination. But being good bureaucrats, Gypsy decided if we're going to write a few regulations, let's write a lot of regulations. and they certainly did. They put in this definition of what they call competitive injury, which is a new term to us. The antitrust legal history is full of cases where we have injury to competition, which is an economic concept we kind of understand. This competitive injury thing is kind of not understandable because it's different. They put a very restrictive definition in there that any time an action harms competition, it doesn't leave much. It doesn't leave any wiggle room for any positives to come out of that, which the case law on antitrust has always said we have to balance any gains against any losses. It doesn't really define what the criteria is or whether significance will be required. It's very restrictive. And so just about anything that might have some impact on competitive price levels would probably run afoul of this and thus be a violation of packers and stockyards, even if it wouldn't under the historical antitrust laws. The likelihood to competitive injury definition has some things in it that are just, kind of open doors for lawsuits. One of them is raising rivals' costs, and an example that was provided by Professor Hausman from MIT in his comments was, what if a company adopts a new technology in its packing plant that forces its competitors to do the same? Well, in the short run, they've raised rivals' costs, so can that be held to be illegal, even though it's a technological advancement that in the long run could benefit everyone? We're afraid that it would because it's kind of the letter of the rule. Foreclosing competition through exclusive dealing, I think it would be just a matter of days or weeks before someone would say that marketing contracts are foreclosing competition and thus a violation of the rule. It requires written justification of any prices or contract terms that deviate from standard prices or terms, but there's no guidance as to what an acceptable justification is. So I could keep a justification in my files, but 2 years from now, if I get investigator, if there's a complaint filed, will that be deemed acceptable? It says that conduct can violate the Packers and Stockyards Act without finding of harm to competition. This is a big deal. It flies in the face of almost 100 years of court decisions that have said that this act is about competition, not competitors. It flies in the face of what Congress did in the 2008 Farm Bill when they considered adding this to the law and decided not to. It's really legislation by regulation, and this is a position that has been advocated by John Farrell and Dudley Butler and others that are now in power at USDA, and it really sets a horrible precedent for all of us citizens. And this is not the only thing that this administration is trying to rewrite using regulations, so it's not a real surprise, but it's still not a good precedent. A sweeping definition of unfair and deceptive practices. Some of those are okay. I mean, it says you can't be fraudulent. It says you can't retaliate against growers that exercise their right to free speech or something. I have no problem with some of those, but some of them are quite restrictive and really a problem. It bans packers' purchases from other packers or affiliated companies. Doesn't define what an affiliated company is, but by almost any stretch of the imagination, we think this would cause a lot of trouble for the owners of Triumph. It would obviously cause a lot of problems for Smithfield and their Circle 4 operations and some others that have kind of geographically distant operations. Doesn't mean they won't get to sell these other pigs, but it means that they would be forced through a broker or something so that they didn't trade hands directly. Requires submission of all unique contracts within 10 days of execution. Gives Gypsy the permission to post those on the website. It says that the parties to the contract can identify personal, confidential, and identifiable information, and that Gypsy should redact that, but it doesn't necessarily say that Gypsy will do everything that we deem is confidential. So there's a hole there. Restrictions on contract lengths. It says you've got to have them long enough to recoup for the contract grower to recoup 80% of their investment. It's a restriction. It's one of those things that says that we can't negotiate something that we think is better because the government requires this. A lot of restrictions on terms of if an investment whether that investment be initial upfront or additional after the contract is in force of $25,000 or more is required. And of course, all of us know that $25,000 is a very low threshold for an initial investment in a swine contract growing facility. So what are the impacts? Well, I think the impacts that we're going to have to deal with, should these rules be adopted as written, and there's a lot of comments a lot of suggestions for changes. There's been very little indication from USDA that they would do anything differently, but I will point out that by the letter of the law, USDA shouldn't have been saying anything anyway. USDA shouldn't have been saying anything anyway. They already kind of did more than they should have when they kind of released a document early on that was supposedly an explanation. So I'd have to say, they didn't say anything, but that's what they should have done during the comment period. But I think it's going to cause homogenization. We're going to see fewer premiums paid, and I put no premiums other than carcass, maybe not no, but fewer for sure. I don't think they're after carcass premiums in the least. But I will say this, that there's nothing in there that says that they can't go after them. It does say that packers will have to justify their carcass premiums. Any differences will have to be justified. And anytime this kind of happens, I think we go to the lowest common denominator, and that producer base prices and probably premiums will be lower. We're not going to take the risk of packers are not going to take the risk of overpaying for pigs. They're probably going to gravitate to lower prices. It means higher costs and risk of using contracts. You got a lot of written documentation that you're going to have to keep. It opens the possibility of challenge after challenge because the Packers and Stockyards Act has a private right of action, meaning that any citizen can bring suit under the Packers and Stockyards Act. There are big difficulties for some packers and owners of packing plants with that packer-to-packer buying ban. Legislation by regulation, I think it's a terrible precedent. Uncertainty and liability always equals cost. I mean, from an economic standpoint, that's just always the impact of uncertainty and liability. Variations in individual needs will be ignored due to required justifications. If you're a good negotiator, you're not going to be able to gain much under this. If you're a bad negotiator, you probably won't gain much either, but you'll just have the peace of mind knowing that the good negotiator didn't get anything out of it either. Treat all the same regardless of needs. I think it's likely to lead to further vertical integration. You're going to make raising pigs on contract more expensive and create incentives to build your own barns. You're going to make marketing pigs on contracts more expensive and create incentives to own the supply. And so, if that does grow, then my guess is the next move would be a ban on vertical integration. Mandatory price reporting, we added pork to the system. It's been renewed for 5 years, and we added pork. This is the percentage of pork, of weekly pork production for which prices are reported under the voluntary system. You can see it's quite low. That doesn't mean those prices are wrong, but it does mean that they're pretty shaky. I mean, one or two reports can really move a price when you don't have very much reported, and for some cuts it's quite low. This won't be available anytime soon. It's a negotiated rulemaking process. It's going to take probably the better part of a year and then another 4 to 6 months to start up. In addition, it won't catch anywhere near 100% of the pork because half to 60% probably stays within the companies for processing, doesn't go outside of the processing cuts anyway, hams, bellies, and trimmings, and picnics. The retail cuts will get a higher percentage, those being ribs, loins, and butts, but still it's going to be much less than 100%, but will be almost certainly far greater than 3 or 4%. It will also add to our information weekly exports of pork, which will be much more timely. Okay, let's get to some outlook things here. I'm going to have to hustle to get done here on time, Ned. Key issues for this year: feed costs. Okay. Feed costs certainly have reduced profit outlook dramatically since June. Fourth quarter hog numbers, the September report said that there were fewer hogs backed up on 9/1. I think that was true. There were a few, but not a whole lot. We've had a lot of hogs pulled forward this fall due to excellent performance. We've seen some expansion evidence back in the summer, but the breeding herd on September 1 was lower than on June 1. So at least the USDA numbers fly in the face of that. I think the limiting factor all summer and especially into the fall has been we didn't know what to count of on the feed cost because of the crop, and the uncertainty of this whole rule situation says that, if you would normally expand and wanted to do business with a production contract on the grow finish side or wean to finish side, you don't know what rules you're going to be working under. And so there's a lot of hesitancy when that happens. Demand, domestics, was soft if you look at the last 12 months, but has certainly been improving in the more recent year-over-year monthly comparisons. Exports, year-to-date good. This summer was lower than last year, but I'd point out that the reason that this summer was lower was high prices. And if we look at revenue in the last few weeks, the last few months, they've been higher than a year ago. So even though we're shipping fewer pounds, prices of those products have gone up, and our revenues from exports have actually risen, contributing more to hog prices. Here are the demand index for the three major species, and you can see for the last 12-month period, all of them are down. 5.4 on beef, 3.6 on pork, 1.4 on chicken. But the most recent monthly index, September, is positive year over year for all of them. So we're really still trying to overcome some very soft demand situations last summer, but seem to be making some gains on that. And one of the reasons is that retail prices are finally going up, and that's one of the pieces of data that go into that demand index computation. We've now set 6 records in a row for hog prices. Cattle prices, beef prices are very close to their record highs. Turkey prices were record high again last month. Chicken is within 5 cents of its record high. These costs are getting passed along to consumers. It just takes a long time to get it done. We're going to see that in spades and cattle, I think, in 2011 and 12, as they take longer to react than anyone else. Hog producers have healed up some from where they were last spring. Of course, a huge decline in kind of this accumulated profits graph. This is profits from selling 1 pig per month since 1991. We get back to about 50% recovery according to the futures yesterday. The X on this chart says that's where we were back in June. You could have locked that kind of improvement in back in June. Of course, not now because of higher grain prices. The Hogs and Pigs report, no expansion. A little bit smaller breeding herd than what we expected back on September. A little bit smaller breeding herd than what we expected back on September 1. The survey for December will come out this week probably for December 1 inventories, so we'll watch those at the end of the month. Notice, though, that the breeding herd at 98.2 is smaller than the farrowing intentions going forward. So we're expecting some increase in productivity. Litter sizes are still going up. So even with a breeding herd slightly smaller than a year before, I think we're going to see a little bit of growth in output come 2011. The last 5 or 6 weeks, we've been above year-ago levels on slaughter. That was a bit of a surprise. The red line here is what we expected out of the September report. So we've been about 4% above that since early October. Even though we've been killing a lot of hogs, they've been getting awfully big before we got them to town. And if we back up one, and I'll try to re-engineer that here. Look at that. How about that? It worked. That 2.33, 2.35 million heads we've been slaughtering is pretty close to a 5.4-day capacity. So we've been killing them about as fast as we can kill them. They've gotten very heavy. This is just the barrows and gilts reported under mandatory price reporting. And, of course, last week they got heavier again when we took a day off on Thursday. I think that number is going to start coming down. It had started down earlier in November. Thanksgiving always throws kind of a wrench in the works on that. As those supplies have gone up, we've seen pressure on cutout values falling from the low 90s down into the mid-70s here. Some strengthening in the last 4 weeks, which is encouraging that we may have kind of seen this seasonal low earlier in the year. We certainly saw a seasonal decline earlier in the year than we normally do. If we look at hog prices, this is national negotiated net prices down around $60. Of course, they may have made a bottom. Excellent packer margins. Now, packers usually make more money in the fall. We don't see this kind of gross margin very often. As a matter of fact, that's the highest since 1999 that we saw just last week. There's room there to chase pigs if the supply of pigs gets lower. But as long as these hog supplies stay very high, there's not a lot of incentive to be chasing them, and we won't see a lot of improvement. But the existence of this kind of a gross margin normally makes packers pretty aggressive when they get the need for pigs out there. We haven't seen it yet. Sow slaughter, the highest levels of the year, the last 2 weeks. There's probably some liquidation of smaller or less efficient herds out there. They're looking at next year, and some of them cannot pencil in a profit for this and may be shipping some sows. So any expansion we're seeing of refilling of empty sow barns is likely being offset at the present time. I don't think there's much change in the breeding herd going on at the moment. And then finally, the projections for profits next year are much better than they were just a few weeks ago. These numbers got down that the 2011, about a month ago, I had projected losses of $2 to $3. Now that is up to a profit of $8 per head for next year. Slaughter forecast, you can see on the right-hand side, I think we're going to have larger slaughter next year, and that percentages are going to get larger as we go to the end of the year. Even though we're not growing the sow herd much, I think productivity is going to carry us. And then finally, my price forecasts are the second column from the right here. National net negotiated prices in the, trading up into the 80s next summer. Now, one point I would make is compare these different price forecasts to the CME futures as of yesterday, and you can see that those second and third quarter hog futures are extremely good relative to what most analysts think prices are going to be. I would probably be pricing some hogs into those where you have very good profit margins for those summer hogs.